My daughter told me I was moving into Cresthaven Senior Living, and my son-in-law had already spoken to a realtor. I didn't argue. I said I needed time to think. For 3 weeks, they believed they had won. When the papers were finally set on the table and the buyers arrived with their financing, my attorney opened her folder, and everything my daughter had planned for the past 4 months came apart in the time it takes to read 2 pages. Good evening, dear friends. I'm Emma, and I'm glad you found your way here. Please stay with me until the end of this one. If you're listening from somewhere across this country, I'd genuinely love to know where. These stories travel farther than I ever expect them to, and knowing you're out there means more than I can easily say. My name is Ruth Eleanor Whitfield, and I have lived in my house on Sycamore Lane in Richmond, Virginia. Before I tell you what happened last spring, I want you to understand what 38 years in a house actually means. It means you know which stair creaks and which one doesn't. It means the light in the kitchen in early morning is something you have memorized without trying. It means the garden you planted in sections over 3 decades is less something you tend and more something you have a relationship with. My husband Thomas planted the dogwood tree in the backyard the spring our daughter Sandra was born. It is now taller than the house, and every April it blooms white and reliable, the way good things do when you leave them alone. Thomas died 2 years ago. A Tuesday in November, the kind of unremarkable day that has no business holding something so large. He was 68, which is not old. Not anymore. But the heart has its own calendar and doesn't consult you about it. He was a quiet man, a civil engineer who drew straight lines for a living and had a crooked, wonderful laugh, and the house became different without him. Not lesser. Exactly. Just altered. Like a song you have always known, played in a different key. Our daughter Sandra is 44. She lives 20 minutes away with her husband Greg and their daughter Lily, who is 21 and studying nursing at Virginia Commonwealth University. Sandra has always been organized, efficient, the kind of person who makes lists before making lists. I had always thought of this as a strength. That was before I understood how certain kinds of efficiency are really just control, wearing a practical hat. The questions began in January. Not all at once. Sandra has always been careful, and she did not begin with anything that sounded unreasonable. She asked whether I found the house difficult to maintain now that I was on my own. She asked whether the stairs had ever worried me, meaning my hips, which were fine. She asked, almost in passing, what I thought the property might be worth these days, with how the Richmond market had been moving. I answered honestly because that is what I do, and I said the house was no burden, my hips were perfectly well, and I had no particular interest in what the market was doing because I was not planning to sell. She nodded. She said, of course. She helped me clear the dinner dishes and said she would call on Sunday. Greg began coming to Sunday dinners in February. He is a personable man, the kind who fills a room and knows it, and he arrived each week with a bottle of wine and a question. The questions were always about the house. He walked through it the way a contractor walks through a renovation, noting things aloud. He said the roof would need attention in the next few years. He said the landscaping was more than one person should have to manage. He mentioned a friend who had recently moved his mother into a senior community and found it a very positive experience for everyone involved. He said everyone involved twice. I served dinner and changed the subject. But I noticed March came and the dogwood budded. And my daughter sat down at my kitchen table one evening after Greg had walked the perimeter of the backyard slowly, his hands in his pockets, looking at the fence line, the way you look at a thing you are already calculating. Sandra set a brochure on the table. Cresthaven Senior Living, it said, in a font designed to look calming. She told me they had a lovely 2-room suite available. She told me there was a community garden and afternoon bridge games. She told me the medical support was excellent. And then she used a phrase I have thought about many times since. She said, "Mom, you have to be realistic about what's appropriate at your stage." Your stage. As though being 72 were a condition with a prognosis. Greg came in from the backyard and sat down and told me they had already spoken to a real estate attorney, just for information, just to understand the process. He told me the house would list well, given the lot size and the neighborhood, and that with what they anticipated it would sell for, I could live very comfortably at Cresthaven for many years. He said comfortable several times, the way people say a word when they want you to feel it rather than examine it. I looked at my daughter. I looked at the brochure. I thought about the dogwood tree and 38 years and Thomas measuring the yard before he planted it. I thought about Lily sitting on this kitchen floor as a 3-year-old arranging measuring cups by size while I made bread. And I said I would think about it. They left that evening looking relieved, which told me something important. They had expected more resistance. They had prepared for it. My agreement to think about it had registered, for both of them, as a kind of early surrender. What I actually did that evening was sit very still in my kitchen for a long time. The house around me was quiet in the specific way it had been quiet since Thomas died, which is not emptiness, but presence of a different kind. A memory of noise. And I let the full shape of what had just happened settle into me. My daughter had walked into my home and told me my life here was over. She had brought a brochure. She had brought her husband to walk the fence line. She had said the words real estate attorney and selling and appropriate at your stage. And she had done all of it with the composed, gentle manner of a person who has told herself she is doing something kind. That is the part that required the most sitting with, because perhaps some part of her believed it. People are capable of wanting something badly enough that the wanting rewrites itself into caring. I have lived long enough to know that, but the house was mine. Thomas and I had paid off the mortgage 11 years ago. My name was on the deed. My name alone, since the estate had transferred properly after his death. I was not confused. I was not failing. I was a widow who still cooked from scratch and drove herself to appointments and grew tomatoes every summer and had every intention of continuing to do exactly that. I was also, for the first time in several years, entirely and quietly furious. I did not sleep well that night. I lay in the dark and listened to the house and thought carefully about what my options were. I could refuse outright, but I had already seen how my daughter operated, and a flat refusal would simply begin a longer campaign. She would involve doctors. She would use the word capacity, which is a very small word for a very large threat, because the suggestion that an older woman living alone might not be making sound judgments is a lever that can move a great deal if you know where to put it. So I decided I would not refuse outright. I would appear to be considering. I would be cooperative and thoughtful and take my time. And while I was appearing to take my time, I would act. The next morning I drove to the library on West Broad Street, which has always been one of my favorite places on earth. I asked the librarian, a young man with a beard and very good manners, for materials on Virginia property law, life estates, and elder property rights. He found me 3 books and 2 pamphlets and asked no questions, which I appreciated deeply. I spent 5 hours reading. I took notes in the small notebook I keep in my purse for grocery lists and phone numbers and, apparently, legal research. By early afternoon, I understood several things I had not known that morning. A life estate deed allows a property owner to transfer ownership of a home to a named remainder beneficiary while retaining the absolute legal right to live there until death. A revocable living trust offers similar protections with more flexibility and additional layers. Virginia has specific statutory protections for senior property owners that are more robust than many people realize. And I needed a real estate attorney who had absolutely no connection to my daughter or her husband. I found her in the phone book. I still keep a phone book. Her name was Rebecca Marsh, and her listing said real estate transactions, estate planning, and elder law. 26 years serving the Richmond community. I called from the library parking lot. Her assistant gave me an appointment for Thursday of the following week. I drove home, made soup, and when Sandra called that evening to ask whether I had looked at the Cresthaven website, I told her I had, and that the facility looked genuinely pleasant. She sounded warm and relieved. She said she was so glad I was keeping an open mind. I thanked her and said goodnight, and I sat in Thomas's reading chair, which I have never moved from the corner of the living room. And I thought, my darling girl, you have made the mistake of assuming that a woman who is quiet is a woman who is finished. Rebecca Marsh's office was on the second floor of a building near the river, and it smelled like coffee and old books, which immediately made me feel I was in the right place. She was in her early 50s, compact and direct, with reading glasses on a chain, and the focused manner of someone who has spent a career listening to people in difficult situations, without losing either her patience or her precision. She shook my hand firmly. She did not slow down her speech or raise her voice or add unnecessary softness to her words, and I cannot tell you how much that mattered to me right then. I told her everything. The brochure. The real estate attorney they had already consulted. The phrase, appropriate at your stage. I told her what I had read at the library, and what I suspected, and what I intended to do. She listened without interrupting, and when I finished, she was quiet for a moment, and then she said, Mrs. Whitfield, you are better prepared than most people I see with law degrees. Let's talk about your options. The house was entirely mine, she confirmed. Sandra had no legal authority to force a sale, initiate a transfer, or compel me to do anything with the property. Whatever consultations she and Greg had undertaken with their attorney were exercises in wishful thinking. I could simply refuse, and she could do nothing. But Rebecca also told me about a step that would make any future attempt impossible rather than merely unsuccessful. I could establish a revocable living trust and transfer the deed into it, with myself as sole trustee for my lifetime and a named remainder beneficiary of my choosing. The trust could include a provision requiring a letter from Rebecca's office submitted to the title company no less than 72 hours before any closing. Without that letter, no reputable title company in Virginia would process the transfer, and I could name anyone I wished as the remainder beneficiary. Anyone at all. I thought about that for a moment. Then I told Rebecca who I wanted to name. She looked at me with something that was not quite a smile, but was close to one. She said, "That's an interesting choice." I said I thought it was the right one. I chose Lily, my granddaughter, Sandra's own daughter. I had several reasons. Lily was 21, studying to be a nurse, and working part-time to cover what her scholarship didn't. She had sat with Thomas in his last weeks without being asked, and read to him from his favorite books when his eyes were too tired. And she had done it without making it seem like a sacrifice, which is one of the more generous things a person can do. She had never once spoken about the house the way her parents had. She spoke about it the way I did, as a place where things happened that mattered. There was also the other reason. The one I did not say aloud but felt clearly. Whatever Sandra and Greg were planning, Lily was not part of it. She would be protected. And the irony of a scheme to take the house from me, ending with the house passing eventually to their own daughter, seemed, under the circumstances, entirely appropriate. We scheduled a second appointment, and I drove home through Richmond in the late afternoon, feeling something I had not felt in weeks, which was simply capable. 6 days later, the precaution I had taken in asking Rebecca to run a title search on the property came back with information I had not been prepared for. Someone had contacted 3 real estate brokerages in the Richmond area requesting comparative market analyses on my property. The requests had been submitted under the name Greg Harmon, Sandra's husband, and in each request, he had listed himself as the authorized estate representative for the property owner. He was not my estate representative. I had given him no power of attorney. He had no legal designation of any kind. He had told 3 real estate agencies that he did, and they had sent him detailed valuations of my home. The number that came back most consistently was $390,000. I sat with that number for a long time. $390,000. The dogwood tree. Thomas's measuring tape. 38 springs of watching things bloom. Rebecca called it misrepresentation of authority. The brokerages, acting in good faith on his claim, had handed him information and leverage he had no right to possess. I thought about calling Sandra. I could hear exactly how she would explain it. Greg was only gathering information. They were being thorough. They just wanted to be prepared. And perhaps a woman who was not paying close attention would accept that, would hear those words and feel something like guilt about having doubted them, and hand over the door key along with her peace of mind. But I had seen the number, and I understood now, with total clarity, that whatever love existed in my daughter's heart for me, it was currently very far behind $390,000, and whatever plans had already been built around it. I signed the trust documents the following Tuesday. Lily was named as the remainder beneficiary. The deed was transferred into the Whitfield Family Living Trust that same afternoon. As of Tuesday, no signature of mine on any document my daughter or her husband produced would legally transfer the property, because the property no longer belonged to Ruth Eleanor Whitfield, the individual. It belonged to the Whitfield Family Living Trust, and the terms of that trust were known only to me and Rebecca. I called my closest friend Carol that same evening. Carol has been my best friend for 31 years. We met in a neighborhood Bible study when our children were still in elementary school, and our friendship outlasted the Bible study by several decades. She moved to Savannah 2 years ago, after her knee replacement and the sale of her own house, and there are days when her absence is a specific kind of ache. She answered on the second ring. I told her all of it. I did not manage my words or compose my expression because with Carol, I have never had to. I told her my daughter was planning to take my home and that I had spent 2 weeks quietly dismantling the plan, and then I told her what I had done with the trust and with Lily's name on it, and there was a pause, and Carol said, "Ruth, does Lily know?" I said she did not yet. Carol was quiet for another moment, and then she said, "That girl is going to cry when she finds out." And then she said, "Are you eating regularly?" I laughed. It was the first time I had laughed since January. Carol told me I had done everything correctly. She told me what I already knew, but needed to hear from someone outside my own head, which is that I was not confused, I was not a burden, and I was not going to be moved out of my home by a brochure and a man walking my fence line. She also told me about a resource she had found when she was dealing with her own estate planning challenges. A nonprofit called Virginia Seniors Legal Aid that assisted older adults navigating exactly these kinds of situations. Not a law firm, but a team of people who knew the landscape. I called them the following morning. A woman named Patricia spoke with me for an hour. She confirmed everything Rebecca had already told me about my legal standing. She also told me something practical and important. If Sandra or Greg ever moved to challenge my mental competency, the evidentiary bar was substantial. A woman who had independently sought legal counsel, understood complex trust instruments, and managed her own finances and property was not a woman any court would easily find incompetent. The threat of capacity challenge, Patricia said, is almost always exactly that. A threat. It almost never becomes a real legal action because the challengers rarely have the evidence to support it. She gave me the name of a geriatric neurologist who offered cognitive assessments for exactly this kind of situation. Precautionary documentation. I made an appointment and had the assessment done the following week. The doctor shook my hand afterward and said I had one of the clearer minds he had seen in his practice in some time. And he said it with a directness that I found enormously comforting. The documentation was filed. If Sandra or Greg ever used the word capacity again, I would have 4 pages of clinical evidence waiting. The anxiety I had been carrying since the kitchen table conversation did not leave entirely, but it changed quality. It became something with an edge to it. Something that felt less like fear and more like readiness. I had Rebecca. I had Carol in Savannah. I had Virginia Senior's legal aid and Patricia. I had documentation. I had a trust that Sandra knew nothing about. I had Lily's name on a piece of paper in the Franklin County Courthouse. And I had an appointment coming that Sandra believed was a formality and was not. On the evening before the appointment, Sandra arrived at my door with Greg, and a foil-covered dish, she said, was a chicken casserole. I let them in. I put the casserole in the refrigerator. I made tea. We sat in the living room where the light was good and the dogwood was visible through the back window, and Sandra told me she had made some calls and everything was arranged. The listing would go active within the week. She had scheduled the closing appointment for the following morning at the offices of their attorney, a man named Douglas who handled residential closings downtown. She produced a packet of documents from her bag. A deed of sale. A seller's disclosure. Several other pages I did not read in detail. She set them on the coffee table and looked at me with the careful warmth of a person managing a transition. She said this was going to be a good change. She said Cresthaven had a waiting list and they were lucky to have the suite held. She said Greg had handled everything. Greg nodded from the armchair nearest the window and told me the buyers were a young couple. The Garcias, who had been looking in the neighborhood for months. He said they were very nice people. He said it the way you describe furniture you are donating, with generic goodwill and no particular attachment. I looked at my daughter for a long moment. I looked at the documents on the table. I thought about Lily reading to Thomas in his final weeks. I thought about Carol in Savannah saying, "Are you eating regularly?" I thought about Rebecca and her colored tabs in her office above the river. And I said, "I appreciate everything you've arranged. I'll be there tomorrow morning." Sandra exhaled. I watched her shoulders come down by about an inch. She reached across and put her hand over mine and said she knew this was hard, but that she was proud of me for being so sensible. Sensible. That word again. I thanked them for the casserole and walked them to the door and watched Greg's car back out of the driveway. And then I went to Thomas's chair and sat in it and allowed myself exactly 15 minutes of feeling the full grief of what was underneath all of this. Not grief for the house. Grief for the daughter I thought I knew. The one who had grown up in this house and sat on this floor and arranged measuring cups by size. That daughter was still in there somewhere, but she had let someone else drive for a very long time. I arrived 12 minutes early. I wore the navy blazer I had worn to Lily's high school graduation, and I carried my purse and Rebecca's organized folder. And I had eaten breakfast and slept well, and I was 72 years old, and I have genuinely never been more ready for anything. Rebecca was in the lobby. She stood when she saw me, shook my hand, and said quietly, "The title confirmation came through this morning. Everything is exactly as filed." She had a folder under her arm with tabs in 3 colors. And I found the tabs quietly reassuring in the way that thorough preparation always is. Sandra and Greg arrived at 9:58. Sandra was dressed carefully, a blazer and silk blouse I had given her for her birthday 3 years ago. Greg had his good shoes on. They came in looking like people arriving to collect something they had been promised. Which, is precisely what they believed they were doing. Douglas, their attorney, was already in the conference room with his documents and a practiced efficiency that suggested he expected to be done before 11. He had not offered coffee to anyone, which I noted. He greeted me by name, asked me to confirm my identity and my ownership of the property at 1420 Sycamore Lane, Richmond, Virginia. I confirmed my identity. Then, I said, "Before we proceed, I'd like to introduce my attorney, Rebecca Marsh, who has information relevant to the title status." Douglas paused. He looked at Rebecca. He looked at Sandra. Sandra's expression went through several versions of itself very quickly. Rebecca set one document on the table. She explained in the even and unhurried voice of a woman who has done this many times before that the property at 1420 Sycamore Lane had been transferred into the Whitfield Family Living Trust on March 19th, with Ruth Eleanor Whitfield as sole trustee. She explained that the terms of the trust required her countersignature on any closing submission to the title company no less than 72 hours prior to close. She noted that no such letter had been submitted or authorized. She placed the trust document beside the first. She placed the title search beside that. She placed the filing confirmation from the county recorder's office, date stamped, in the center of the table where every person in the room could read it clearly. Douglas Reed. His expression was not precisely surprise. It was more specific than that. It was the expression of a professional who has just understood that he performed inadequate due diligence on a transaction and who is now experiencing the particular discomfort of that understanding in a room full of witnesses. He had not run an independent title search. He had taken Greg's representations about the property at face value. He had not verified. He had assumed a 72-year-old widow would simply sign where she was told to sign. Greg stood up. He said, "This is," and then stopped and said, "What is this?" His voice had left its professional register entirely. He sounded the way people sound when something they considered finished turns out not to be finished. Sandra looked at me with an expression I had not seen on her face since she was a teenager, a very specific combination of anger and the dawning knowledge that she had miscalculated. She said, "Mom, when did you do this?" I said, "Several weeks ago." She said, "Why didn't you tell me?" I said, "For the same reason you didn't tell me you had already contacted 3 real estate agencies using Greg's name and a designation he was not authorized to hold." Silence. Greg looked at Sandra. Douglas began organizing his documents with the controlled movements of a man who has decided that his best exit from this situation is a professional one. He murmured something to Greg about the trust appearing to be properly formed and filed. Greg said, "There must be something," Douglas said quietly, that he did not see grounds for that assessment, and that he needed a moment to review. The Garcias and their attorney had been seated at the far end of the table throughout this, the young couple growing more still as the room shifted around them. Their attorney leaned over and spoke to them in a low voice. The husband looked at his wife. The wife looked at me, and I thought her expression was a kind of recognition, the look of someone watching something being corrected. They stood. They gathered their pre-approval letter and their carefully organized folder. The young woman paused for just a moment near the door and looked at me with something that I can only describe as a small nod of acknowledgement. And then they were gone, and the door closed with a sound that was quieter than you would expect for the end of something. Greg sat down heavily. Sandra had not moved. The room had the particular quality of silence that follows something irreversible. Douglas said he would need to speak with his client privately and excused himself. Greg followed him into the hall. Sandra remained at the table. I looked at my daughter, my only child, the person I had rocked at 3 a.m. through ear infections and driven to soccer practice, and watched walk across a stage in a cap and gown, and loved with a completeness that has no adequate description. I looked at her and I said, Sandra, the house is mine. It has been mine, and it will remain mine for as long as I choose to live in it. When I am gone, the trust will speak for itself. I suggest you and Greg speak to your own estate attorney about what comes next, because I have already spoken to mine. She started to say something. I picked up my folder and thanked Rebecca and walked out of the conference room and through the lobby and into a Richmond morning in early April, with the sky a clear, clean blue and the air carrying the first real warmth of spring. I stood on the sidewalk for a moment. I had not noticed until I walked outside how tightly I had been holding everything. Down the block, someone was walking, a large dog who was enormously interested in a particular patch of sidewalk. And a delivery truck was double parked, and a woman in scrubs was coming out of the coffee shop across the street. And the city was simply going on, the way cities do, indifferent to the size of what had just happened inside a conference room on the third floor. And I was standing in it, intact and clear and mine. The silence from Sandra lasted 9 days. In those 9 days, I cleaned out the storage room that had needed attention for a year and a half, painted the back bedroom a shade of blue I had always wanted and never gotten around to, and planted 2 new dogwood saplings along the side fence because I had been meaning to add them for years. I had dinner with my neighbor Jeanne, who has lived 3 houses down since her husband was transferred here in 1998, and whom I had always meant to know better. She turned out to have strong opinions about roses and an extremely funny story about a raccoon and her trash cans that had me laughing harder than I had laughed in months. I also called Lily. She answered immediately, the way young people answer their grandmothers, with a warmth that bypasses whatever else is happening. I told her what I had done. I told her about the trust and her name on it and why I had put it there. She was quiet for a long moment, and then she said, "Grandma," in a voice that was doing its best not to crack. And then she said, "You didn't have to do that." And I said, "I knew I didn't have to, and I wanted to." And then she was quiet again, and I heard her take a breath, and she said, "Thank you. Carol had been right," she cried. On the 10th day, Sandra called. Not the organized, managing voice, her actual voice, which I had not heard in some time. She told me she was sorry. She said she had behaved in ways she was ashamed of, and that she had let Greg's thinking become her thinking without asking herself the right questions. She said she was sorry twice more before she finished. I listened to the whole apology without interruption. There is a particular discipline required in letting someone say all of what they have to say before you respond, especially when you love them. I let her say all of it. Then I said, "Sandra, I believe you're sorry, and I also believe things became true this spring about what you were willing to do that I cannot pretend I didn't see. We're going to have to live with both of those things being true at the same time." She was quiet. I said, "The trust stands as written. Lily is named as the remainder beneficiary, and that is not going to change. What changes is up to you, not because I'm angry, but because what you leave behind you is made of choices." There was a long pause. Then she said, "Does Lily know?" I said she did. Another pause, and Sandra said, very quietly, "Okay. Just that. Okay." The consequences arrived in their own time, the way consequences always do. Douglas filed a self-review with the Virginia State Bar, noting the due diligence shortfall, getting ahead of anything that might come from Rebecca's direction. It was a professional calculation, and not an inaccurate one. The filing was noted. These things have a way of being remembered in small fields, where reputations travel quietly. Greg, I learned through Jean and the layered social geography of a neighborhood where people have lived for decades, had borrowed money from Sandra's parents in anticipation of an asset that did not arrive. Sandra's father, a retired contractor who had built his business carefully over 40 years and had opinions about people who move fast with other people's property, was not forgiving. The loan was called in. It was repaid, but the repayment left marks. A trip they had planned was not taken. Greg's lease on his truck was not renewed. Sandra quit a fitness class she had mentioned joining. Not transferred. Quit. Whether those difficulties changed anything fundamental between them, I genuinely do not know. I hope they did, not because I wished them harm, but because I hoped the weight of what had happened would press them both towards something more honest. The Garcias found a house on the north side of Richmond 2 months later, 3 bedrooms with a yard their kids could grow into. Their attorney mentioned it to Rebecca in passing. I was glad to hear it. They had walked into my story carrying nothing but reasonable hope and a pre-approval letter. And they deserved their own good ending, with no part of mine attached to it. I amended the trust in July. Rebecca drew up revised documents with more specificity. Lily remained the primary beneficiary. I added several others. A scholarship at the high school where Thomas had coached youth baseball for 11 years. A sum for Virginia Seniors Legal Aid, because they had helped me understand my rights when I most needed to understand them. A small gift to the neighborhood library branch on West Broad Street, where a young man with a beard had found me 3 books and 2 pamphlets and asked no questions. Each edition felt right. An estate plan should be a portrait of what you valued, not an accounting of who hurt you. By September, the new dogwood saplings had taken hold. They were small still, years from the height of the old tree, but they were healthy and growing, and the nursery had guaranteed the variety. I felt a satisfaction in planting them that I did not try to analyze, because some things are clear enough without analysis. Lily came for dinner on a Sunday in October. She helped me cook, and we ate at the kitchen table where the light is best in the evening, and we talked for 3 hours about her nursing program and her roommate and a patient she had sat with who had reminded her of Thomas. Before she left, she stood in the kitchen doorway and looked at the room the way you look at a place you know will matter to you for a long time, and she said, "This house is going to be okay, Grandma." I said I knew it was. I travel now. A long weekend in Charleston that Thomas and I had always planned and never managed. I walked the Battery in the early morning when the light was gold on the harbor and ate she-crab soup at a place with ceiling fans and rocking chairs and felt something I had not felt in longer than I could precisely measure. Just present, just here, belonging to my own life entirely. I went to Savannah and sat on Carol's porch for 5 evenings, watching the light change and talking the way we have always talked, which requires no particular subject. I slept deeply every night I was there. Carol said I looked like myself again. I told her I felt like it. She said, "Good, that's the correct outcome," which is exactly the kind of thing Carol says. My life has a different shape now than it had before all of this. And the shape is better. Not because conflict is good, it is not. But because certain things only become clear under pressure. I know what my home means to me. I know what I am willing to do, to keep what is mine. I know who my people are and where they will be when I call. These are not small things to know. There are people who drift gradually into believing they are entitled to what belongs to others. I think sometimes they do not notice they are drifting. The drift looks, from the inside, like planning, like being practical, like caring for someone. I do not know whether Sandra will find her way back to herself, the girl who grew up in this house and knew these rooms and loved her father. I leave the door open for her. That is all a mother can do. Leave it open and tend her own garden. The dogwood bloomed this spring. Same as always. White and steady and entirely indifferent to everything that had happened beneath it. I sat on the back porch with my coffee and watched it for a long time and thought about Thomas measuring the yard. I thought about 38 Springs and all the things that had rooted here, some that had been lost and some that were still growing. The house is mine. It has always been mine, and I will live in it, among my things and my memories and my budding trees, for exactly as long as I choose to. So that is the story of the year I nearly let my silence be mistaken for consent and decided not to. Here is what I know more surely now than I knew before. No one can take from you what you have taken the time to protect. Not legally, and not emotionally. If someone in your life has ever moved through your home like they were appraising it, if someone has ever used words like practical and appropriate at your stage and meant it as a door closing rather than a conversation, I hope you remember this. You are allowed to be quiet and still be 3 steps ahead. And a woman who does not argue is not necessarily a woman who agrees. She may simply be a woman who has already called her attorney. What would you have done in my place? I'd genuinely like to know. Leave your thoughts in the comments, because so many of you have written to me about situations like this one, and your words matter more than you know. If this story found you at the right time, please stay. There's more. And thank you truly, from the bottom of my heart, for being here.